Okay, so good evening everyone and welcome to the August free webinar for CISN, which we present in conjunction with Functional Sports Nutrition magazine. I'm Ian Craig, your host this evening, and I'm keen to welcome on Emma Beswick, who is a new presenter for us. She hasn't done a webinar yet. She is the CEO of LifeCode GX. She's also a fellow nutritional therapist and a fellow runner. She describes herself as a recreational runner, and she's going to be bringing some of her personal journey into this evening's presentation. So I'm really looking forward to it. The pattern that will follow is as normal. We'll let Emma run with the presentation. If there's any burning questions, please fire them in the chat box. And if I think they're relevant, I'll unmute and ask Emma that question. We'll get to the end of our presentation after 45 minutes. I'm just going to throw in a quick couple of announcements, and then we'll get onto a question and answer section at the end. So Emma, over to you.
Thank you very much for that intro, Ian, and welcome everyone. I do recognise a few names in the chat list, so it's really nice to see you. And for people who I've never met before, I've got a little bit more of a brief introduction. If I just need to work out my tech. Okay, so as Ian said, I am a nutritional therapist. I actually decided to train as a nutritional therapist to support my own running. So I, about 10 years ago, had a series of kind of personal nightmare scenarios and life events that I found incredibly stressful. And I'd always used running to help me be calm and to kind of help me think and mull things over. And it was a real tool for me in that respect. And when life went horribly wrong, I'd always thought of running in that way, but it was just such a big thing. I felt as if it literally saved me being able to do that. And I decided that I wanted to make sure that I could have that at my disposal for as long in my life as possible. And as long as I have that ability to go for a run, it's almost like meditation, actually, for me. I think that I can cope with a lot of things that life throws at us. So I signed up for a nutrition course at CNM. And then when I was at CNM, I discovered nutrigenomics. So this whole kind of journey helped me to get to running LifeCode and providing nutrigenomic testing at a professional level. So we are a practitioner company. That is our orientation and the vast majority of our work. I always knew that I was interested in nutrigenomics as well, because I'd got involved in fruit fly genetics as a youngster, and that's something that enthused me. But as soon as I did the lectures about nutrigenomics, I knew that I could put this together with my passions for running, for nutrition, for a naturopathic approach to health, but having this extra information at my disposal. So let's get started, because that's just my little mini story. So let's flip through. Okay, so nutrigenomics in context. You will see on this slide a lot of different words, and the aim of this is really to illustrate that there are many dimensions to nutrigenomics. Of course, it is nutrition, and of course it's about genes, but a lot of the time people want a really simple answer, and they just want to look at one gene, one genotype, and to be told, eat this, do that, don't do the other. And the real power is looking at this as a cohesive set of systems, a dynamic set of systems that interact. So on this screen, we have in pink certain gene names, and we're going to be discussing some of these tonight. So we're going to talk about sirtuins, which are known as longevity genes. We're going to talk about PPARs and mitochondrial uncoupling and things like this. But it's all got to be in context, and you see some context here. The main contexts that we're going to talk about tonight are where longevity and physiological performance actually join up and overlap. And so I'll just point out to you the big black items here. We've got AMPK, and above it fasted and burn. So these are some themes about energy generation, fuel burning, in order to make ACP and energy. And then on the other side, we've almost got the opposite part of the seesaw, which is around mTOR, which I will explain these terms. And this is a pathway and a set of systems that are more active in a fed state, and help with growth and renewal of cells and muscles and all those things. And in amongst all of this, we've got dynamic things like foods and food groups and hormones and vitamins and all those different components here. So the big message is that you have to embrace the connectedness of all these different components and parts. But there are ways of doing this and ways of joining up the dots on the jigsaw. So let's see how we go. So some just really basic principles of nutrigenomics. We are talking about genes, and we're talking about SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, which are very, very small letters. It's the smallest unit that can be altered in terms of genetic variants. When we look at SNP selection and gene selection, we'll start off by looking at a topic. We will read and follow and research thought leaders in a particular area. We'll look at pathways, so we'll understand that context, and then we'll look at biochemical pathways, understand the genes that are involved in those pathways, what their function is, and then to look through reams and reams of research to identify SNPs, or these small variances that have a good evidence base behind them. And what we're looking for is variances that are frequent. So anything less than 1% of the population doesn't make it. Those are counted as rare. And we're also looking at SNPs where we can understand the impact of that SNP, so the effect it has on the gene function, the mechanism that it's disrupting, and therefore that enables us to work out what nutrition and lifestyle support can compensate for that. And then at the bottom again, you can have one gene that can make a difference, but often a SNP can make a small difference on its own. And so the real power is when you start to build up the picture of how genes connect to other genes, what the substrates are, what the cofactors and inhibitors are, and understand what is happening to that individual in respect of all those different components. And context is key. So you can have a situation where one SNP is positive and helpful in one context and negative and unhelpful in another. So this is why the pathways and the visualizations are quite important. So one example is interleukin 6, and interleukin-6 is usually thought of as being a negative thing. It's inflammatory is bad, and so on and so forth. That's the kind of idea that people have in mind. And you can have a variance on interleukin-6, IL-6, that upregulates that activity. And so that is most often reported in nutrigenomics tests as being a bad thing, part of an inflammatory kind of risk profile. But you can actually view IL-6, and the very same SNP has got very convincing evidence that explains that it can be a positive, helpful, beneficial thing to have this variance, this version of IL-6. It is still associated with higher activity, but actually a lot of exercise adaptation is dependent on inflammation. So we want that inflammation, we want that stress, that moderate sort of stress, in order for the body to respond in a good way and adapt and build. And so this is really, really important, that when you look at genes and you look at SNPs, you don't just think bad, 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 bad. It's not the case. It does absolutely depend on the context. You can also have SNPs that are just good, like in general. So a SNP can be a superpower. It isn't necessarily a detrimental thing in any way. And we've got some examples of that coming up too. Okay. This slide is from a paper that identified initially 9 hallmarks of aging. So it's one of those seminal papers that everyone in the longevity world jumped on and built their principles on and wrote their books around and did research around. But I think the main takeaway here is, what is a definition of aging and how does that relate to exercise and relate to sport? So aging is characterized by a progressive loss of physiological integrity, etc., etc. Increased vulnerability to death. I mean, that's kind of a pretty big statement, but you get the point that the emphasis is on the physiological integrity, which is obviously a hugely important part of performance in a exercise or athlete context. So there are a lot of dimensions to this. We're not going to look at all of them tonight. I'm just using that as the start point. So we are going to look at or feature a few of these items. We're going to talk about mitochondria. Of course, mitochondria are going to be hugely important in the context of energy, and nutrient sensing is another one, and genomic instability. They're all connected, just like the first slide, but these are the things that I'm structuring the presentation around. And I've put the little runners in the middle instead of the growing older people. I don't know if you noticed that. So, okay, so nutrient sensing, burn or grow. Okay, so to come back to the contextual slide that I showed you up front, what we're going to really examine is a pathway that is oriented around AMPK. We're also going to look a little bit at mTOR. So AMPK, AMP activated protein kinase. I do like biochemistry because I find the words describe the function quite often, and that's the same with genetics. It's just a different language, and the clue is often in the name. So AMPK is fundamental to burning of energy. It's the catabolic pathway, and it's actually induced by a low energy state. And I know some people on the call will know all of this, but it's just some background before we get into the genes. And so AMPK is induced if there is relatively high AMP to ATP. It's a little bit more complex than that, but that's the key principle. There's a lot of AMP, that is indicative of a low energy state, and it will start to trigger the activity of these pathways. Things that might contribute to that low energy state are in purple here. So like caloric restriction, which is huge in the longevity literature and world. And exercise, of course, can also induce a low energy state. And so this triggers a whole chain of events that involve fatty acid oxidation, for example, glucose uptake, glycolysis, so the breakdown of these fuels in order to generate energy, and something called mitochondrial biogenesis, which the simple word for that is it's just how healthy are your mitochondria? Are they renewing? How many of them are there? Are they in a good, healthy state? So the more mitochondria we have, the more capacity we have from an energy perspective, and there are genes involved in this. On the other side of the equation, there is the grow state. So when we are fed and when our energy status is high, then the mTOR pathway is initiated, and this stands for mechanistic target of rapamycin. It's a bit of a backwards design in terms of that. So rapamycin is a compound that is, again, seen to be a potential longevity aid that initiates or blocks the mTOR. Okay, so some people might look at this and go, well, isn't AMPK good and mTOR bad? But again, it's not so simple. We want both, but we don't want, and we can't generally have both happening at once. The body has got to be doing one or the other. And to facilitate this, AMPK actually blocks mTOR. So you're either burning energy or you're growing and you're storing energy. It's one or the other, not both at the same time. And so the things that initiate the growth and the storage are things like food intake, particularly glucose and amino acids. So amino acids are a really, really big pusher of mTOR. And that's not surprising, isn't it, when you think what this does? So protein synthesis, muscle growth, etc., etc. Okay, so just going to have a move of my Zoom. Okay, so an AMPK, the whole point is to restore cellular energy. So we're sensing that it's low and we need to create some to address that deficit. So, okay, so this is basically in writing what I've just discussed. There are some other things that activate AMPK as well as caloric restriction, nutrient depletion, etc. So toxins also induce AMPK. They don't have to be strong toxins though. So one of the principles that we'll talk about is hormesis. So things like polyphenol foods are actually mildly toxic, those plant foods, and they have all kinds of amazingly fantastic properties and uses in respect of kind of poking the genes to express in certain ways and kind of get them going. And that applies in this pathway as well. Salicylate, the prodrug of aspirin, is also an inducer of AMPK. And then other activators are down here. So these are some of the polyphenols that I mentioned. By having this mildly toxic kind of character. That's one of the features or functions that they have with respect to AMPK. And that can be incredibly useful, as we will see. Okay, so we've discussed some general things. Now we're going to move on to some genes. So the first gene that we're going to talk about is a sirtuin. So sirtuin 1, there are actually 7 sirtuin genes in humans. So there are a family of genes. A lot of the genetic code is shared, it's common, but they've got slightly different roles to play and they're active in different places. So sirtuins, or SIRT1, is all related to AMPK. It's actually induced by AMPK, because one of the things that AMPK helps to do is it actually increases NAD+. We're going to talk about NAD+ quite a lot. NAD+ is another sensor of low energy states. So when we make energy, I'm not going to get too technical with Krebs cycles and things like that, but when we make energy in the Krebs cycle, we're actually using NAD+, and it becomes NADH. But NAD+, which is a form of niacin or vitamin B3, this is a cofactor for the sirtuin genes. So the sirtuins need NAD+ to be active. And so AMPK generates more NAD+. NAD+ induces or acts as a cofactor for the sirtuin 1, and sirtuin 1 then it activates a gene called PGC1A. So they're all connected. So you see straight away there is this chain of events going on, which involve multiple players. And you can have SNPs in any of these genes as well that can impact how much they express and how reliable they are, how active they are at performing these different jobs. Okay, so let's go to the next page. Okay, so we're going to come back to PGC1A in a minute, but first of all, I just want to talk about NAD a little bit more. So we've got the sirtuins here. They're also induced by polyphenols and caloric restriction and exercise, some ways directly, but via that AMPK route mostly. But there is another big user of NAD+, and that is a gene called PRP1. Again, there are a family of PARP genes, and they're primarily involved in DNA repair, and they need NAD+ to perform the DNA repair function. Now, normally, we want PARP to be working. It's just part of normal life. It's happening all the time. But as we age, and the more exposure we have to environmental toxins and stressors, like pollution or just breathing or sunlight, for example, the more DNA damage is inflicted upon us. And so the more demanding PARP is to use that NAD+. You can also have a situation where PARP is overstimulated in response to damage. So you can even imagine an athlete who's doing a lot of sport, but they're outside running on polluted roads in a lot of sunlight, etc., etc. And that athlete is going to be sending more NAD+ towards the DNA repair route. And it's going to be consuming NAD+ at a rate of knots. And the more revved up this is, the more mistakes it can make. So we want PARP to be working away, but we don't want it to have to be working too hard. So there is actually a SNP on the PARP gene, which confers lower activity, and it's considered protective. So it's almost like more able to put the brakes on rather than allow it to run away with itself and get really, really, really overactive. Because that's when mistakes happen in DNA repair as well, and you start to get cellular damage in other ways and cells growing in the wrong places and all those things like that. Okay, you can see also things like glucose are promoters of that, and also things like H. pylori, so infections also can promote that. Okay, so the big message for this slide is we want to make sure that we've got enough NAD plus for our sirtuins and the whole energy generating pathway. And as we get older, then there's going to be more pressure on that. So to be conscious of our exposure and to minimize that, but perhaps also be conscious of a greater need for NAD plus, and to be more proactively supportive of NAD plus. So this is how NAD plus is made, and we can make it, we do make it in the body. So there are 3 ways that we can preserve our NAD plus levels. The primary or de novo synthesis pathway is from tryptophan. So tryptophan through the kynurenine pathway, which you might be familiar with if you look at serotonin and neurotransmitters, is the primary synthesis route for making NAD plus. There is another pathway called the Price Handler pathway, which again, you can make NAD plus that way. And then there's a salvage pathway, so number 3 here. And the salvage pathway is actually really, really, really important. It's a massive contributor to NAD plus. So we really, really want it to be working hard. And the body's so clever that when it is subject to various stresses, it regulates this salvage pathway. And so it's, you know, it's kind of like, okay, there's some stress happening. I might need more resources. Which resources do I need? I'm going to, you know, I've got this built-in mechanism to make more NAD plus. And you can have genes that impact this. So you can have SNPs on NAMPT, which is this salvage pathway cycle that is creating and saving you NAD plus. You can also take supplements or consider taking supplements and different forms of NAD, and there are a very, very confusing number out there. The latest research seems to say that NR is the most effective, but I'd encourage you to go and do your own research on that. But at least you can see where that's playing in to the process here. So M and N, N and NR, for example, are coming in there. But as we age, our salvage pathway becomes less good. This enzyme NAMPT is less active, and so there is more dependency on the kynurenine pathway. So maybe our diet as we go through life has to adapt to these changing dynamics, and there can be more demand. This would suggest that there is more demand for tryptophan, for example, to supply the NAD. There are quite a lot of other nutrients involved in that process, but that's a little bit too much just to go into now. Okay, so this is a little bit more about, okay, let's come back to why we need NAD plus. It's really one of its major functions is as this cofactor for the sirtuins. And this is quite a nice little summary overview of which sirtuins work where. And so we have sirtuins in the nucleus of a cell, Sirt1, that's where that's active, and you can see that the PRP is active there as well. And what they do is they create, it's called transcription, but they basically create messages to the cell to express certain of the genes and promote the transcription or expression of the genes and making of the proteins. So these affect the nuclear DNA and genes that we see there. And then the sirtuins 3 to 5 are active in mitochondria. And so whichever place they work, you still need the cofactor to support them. Okay, so I'm not going to go into any more detail on that, but the sirtuins, there was a really nice tag there, guardians of the genome, is what they're known as. So they are very, very important for helping to stabilize the genome as well and regulate it and regulate gene expression. Okay, so we're now back to where we were with Sirt1. So we can see NAD there, we can see all the other cofactors, we've got resveratrol in the mix as well. So one of the major functions of Sirt1 is in a metabolic capacity. So it actually induces the expression or transcription of all these genes here. So PGC1A and PPAR alpha are 2 genes that we're going to look at in a bit more detail. MAO is involved mainly in neurotransmitter breakdown, and a SNP on the Sirt1 gene is actually associated with lower activity, more inflammation, diabetes, and also central nervous system imbalances, and that's due to the connection with the MAO there. So it's got a lot of different effects, but then if you know that you have a variant on the Sirt gene, then you also know that there are certain cofactors that can be used to support it and perhaps compensate for that less active, less robust version of the gene. And that is the whole point, really. It's understanding where in our physiology is a little bit weaker and what we can do to support it. So here's a little bit more about why is Sirt1 so important. So Sirt1 is almost a little bit of a side player because the main event is the PGC1A. So PGC1 alpha, again, sets off a chain of events, and look at the bottom here, how many of these events are about energy and energy balance, really. Being able to use glucose, being able to use fatty acids, having healthy mitochondria whose capacity is very, very performant and optimal. So it's kind of impacting all these different aspects. And it's also directly associated with increased proportion and increased volume of slow twitch muscle fiber, which people will know better than I do on this webinar about the connection between that and endurance sport, for example. Okay, and if you have a SNP on PGC1A, that confers lower activity. And that can mean, for example, someone doesn't know this, but they naturally put on weight. They've got a family history of perhaps diabetes, type 2 diabetes, blood sugar dysregulation, etc., maybe fatigue related things, but basically metabolic dysregulation or even metabolic syndrome. In the modern world, the people with dysfunction in these genes are much more vulnerable to metabolic syndrome. We know that everybody is to some extent, but genetically some people are in a worse start point than others. And we've got a couple of new things in here. So we've got cold exposure. So cold exposure via an adrenaline beta receptor actually also can induce PGC1A activity and and then have the benefit of the knock-on effects in inducing the downstream genes and processes. Okay, so a little bit more here about PGC1A, what it does when it's working. And I use the term wild type. So wild type is basically the non-variant. It's the default. It's usually the majority of people have that version of the gene. So it's called wild type. And so the benefits of that are listed there. It's the more active, more functioning gene or version of the gene. And unfortunately, the people who have the variant that is associated with the information in red there, it's the less active version of the gene. But none of this is on or off. It's not categorically one or the other. It's more subtle. So hence, we want to know about it because we want to know where to support people and how to support them in a personalised way. But we're never telling them with nutrigenomics, sorry, you got the Duff kind of deck of cards. We can't do anything about it. So I always think that it's a good thing to understand this stuff. It's empowering rather than disempowering. Okay, so just checking in, Ian, whether there's anything I need to pay attention to with respect to questions yet or anything like that.
No, no questions. You're at just coming up to 40 minutes.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So we'll go on to look at part 2, which is really the mitochondria, the mighty mitochondria, which we all know are the powerhouse of the cell. So they take in the fuel and they churn out energy in return. And there are very complicated processes involved in this. But really, for healthy aging and for best performance, we want our mitochondria to have the most capacity. And that there are 2 key dimensions to that. One is the number of mitochondria. So tens and tens of thousands of mitochondria in each cell is what should be happening. And it's interesting that we always represent mitochondria as having a single electron transport chain, but actually there are thousands of electron transport chains per mitochondria as well. So we're talking about lots and lots and lots of small things all stacking up to perform really, really important functions. And then the other dimension is how healthy are those mitochondria? Are they renewing themselves? So there's fusion and fission where they divide, that's the fission, and create new mitochondria. And there's fusion where they sometimes join together to create a power mitochondria, which can be really important, for example, in immunity. But, you know, it's the mitochondria kind of self-managing really in that respect. So we want both of those dimensions to be super, super optimized. So let's go into a little bit of detail. So you see here we've got glucose and fatty acids coming in. This is obviously a very simplified representation. We've got PGC1A again. So PGC1A also is a massive inducer of mitochondrial biogenesis. So this is the mitochondria making new copies of themselves and going and dividing and being healthy and numerous and robust. And so PGC1A is a really, really important factor in that. And there is also another gene called NRF2, nuclear factor erythroid. I never use the long names, that's why we have short names for the genes. But that is also really, really important in inducing mitochondrial biogenesis. Okay, and if you think back to what we've been saying all along, these things are at the end of a chain. So each of them have their own impacts, and you want the whole chain. It's a bit like a relay race. Everybody's got to do their bit. So I always think you want to try and intervene as early as possible in these pathways, but actually you want to make sure that no one's letting the side down either, and to be supporting every step of the way. There's another new kid on the block here called PQQ. Just hold that thought with PQQ. It's involved in PGC1A, but it's got specific roles to play in mitochondrial health as well. Okay. Okay. We've got another switch point. So we had the kind of switching at the AMPK and the mTOR level. Are we growing at the moment, or are we burning energy at the moment? Is it metabolism, or is it catabolism or anabolism? But we've also got a switch point when it comes to fuel entering the mitochondria. AMPK is involved in this, and basically what happens is when glucose is available, it blocks fatty acid entry into the mitochondria. So as if the mitochondria doesn't really want both fuels entering or flooding it, at least at once. You can have a little bit of a drip in of glucose, and that's useful to get the whole fatty acid burning part of the Krebs cycle happening. But generally, it's about the switch between an AMPK when it's in burn mode. So you're in this, right? We want oxidative energy. AMPK actually blocks malonyl CoA from blocking fatty acid entry. So it's as if it's opening the gate and letting the fatty acids into the cell. And actually for endurance, we really, really want to have trained our systems, our mitochondria, to be able to utilize that fat fuel supply to support the kind of long-term steady, less high intensity activity. Okay, so again, you know, when we've got a lot of glucose, that actually restricts the fatty acid burning. So it's not a total 100% block off, but it's again a case of one or the other. Okay, so that's why, or one reason why, fasting, for example, using up your ready supply of glucose can help to train you to burn fats and think ketogenesis. I think of ketogenesis as being quite an extreme version of this, but that's the principle. Okay, now at the bottom of this diagram, you will see NRF again. You've got NAD all over the place. I'm not going to talk about that too much, but we've got NRF and we've got some new genes also at the bottom here, which are uncoupling proteins, and they're involved in the electron transport chain. Okay, so when we burn the fuel, we make ATP, But this process of burning fuel is quite dirty. It's a bit like an old diesel engine in some ways. So there are a lot of byproducts of this energy generation. It's a normal part of the process, but we need those byproducts to be effectively cleaned up. And NRF works in two places. It helps push the electron transport chain, this energy making process along, but it also helps to regulate antioxidant genes. So just like we had a chain of events earlier on with lots of genes working together, we've got a situation here where NRF2 actually induces GPX1, glutathione peroxidase. The clue is in the name. That uses glutathione to neutralize reactive oxygen species, catalase, and superoxide dismutase 2, or SOD2. So NRF2 is the inducer of this chain of events, which is a very positive chain of events. And we've got another sirtuin in the mix. So sirtuin 3 also induces SOD2 directly. So they're really, really useful, more than useful. They're really, really vital for mopping up the consequences of making and having this energy available. And you can have SNPs on any of these that impact the function. And depending what the specific gene is, then that can guide you as to what nutrient cofactor would be perhaps most beneficial for that individual. Okay. You see we've got PQQ here again. I'm going to come back to PQQ. It's my new favorite nutrient. Okay, so the final set of genes are the mitochondrial uncoupling proteins. And I think of these as the mitochondrial ventilators. So there is the smoke generated, there are the reactive oxygen species, which are the actual damaging oxides that are trying to be mopped up by the antioxidant genes. But uncoupling proteins actually, it's as if they're clearing the air, they're mopping up what leaks out of the electron transport chain. So when we make ATP, there are protons mostly, but there are also electrons that are an important part of that ATP machinery. I don't want to go into that whole thing. It's a huge topic tonight, but the principle is that there can be leakage, and the leakage of those protons can be really, really detrimental. And what uncoupling proteins do is when there is an overload of energy coming through, and that energy isn't all being used, they divert the leaked protons to generate heat. So usually there'll be both. Like when you're exercising, when you're physically active, this will be working really, really hard. You'll be creating ATP and energy, but your system will also be generating heat. And that's a good thing because it is the ventilation. So it's stopping too many leaky components damaging and clogging up the system and causing damage, and effectively then closing it down. Now, UCP proteins, genes, proteins are the same interchangeable names. They are upregulated with cold exposure. And there's a really interesting fact that people from cold climates, like genetically, ancestrally, have much more UCP protein activity, so capacity, than those in hot places. So and that applies to polar bears as well. So they have more fat, but most interestingly and most usefully, they have more brown fat. But we can use that knowledge, and there's lots and lots of information about exactly how this works. By exposing ourselves to cold, we can actually induce our uncoupling proteins to express more, be more active, have more capacity. So that can mean that our energy making machine is a much cleaner machine. It's a cleaner, leaner energy producing machine, and our mitochondria is going to be having a much higher capacity and be able to do that more for longer, and more reliably as well. So back to Sirtuin, because we saw it there, and I thought I'd end with a gene that we almost started with. It's part of the same family. So this is the main sirtuin in mitochondria. It impacts fatty acid beta oxidation pathways, as well as the TCA cycle and the electron transport chain. And as we saw, it also activates the mitochondrial superoxide dismutase, which plays a role in decreasing the reactive oxygen species. Another reason we just don't want too much reactive oxygen species and damaging elements in the mix is because of the DNA damage and stability. And that goes back to full circle. We want our resources to not be consumed with repairing something that need not have become damaged in the first place. So the more we can do to prevent that damage in the first place, again, the more resources we have to do the things that we want to do to build our capacity for efficient energy and physiological performance. And there is a SNP on the SIRT gene, actually, that is one of the superpower SNPs, and this is associated with higher activity. So that's an example of a genetic variance. It isn't always bad. It can actually be a good thing, but it's useful to know which version of the gene you have or your athletes have, so you can decide where to put your energy in terms of support. So, okay. So, this is a little summary, and I'm not going to read it all out, but this is a little summary of some of the genes that we've covered. And the genes that we've covered are obviously just a small selection. But you can kill several birds with one stone as well. So for example, at the top, we've got the two sirtuins and the NAMPT gene. All of those could be involved in NAD, NAD plus availability. So you need NAD plus to help the sirtuins. There's a bit of a kind of virtuous cycle there, and you need the NAMPT to help with the salvage of NAD plus, and to be aware that your sirtuin activity and your NAMPT activity is naturally going to become lower with age. Exercise helps. Exercise absolutely helps. Keep this genome on the edge in terms of being ready to roll. I can't remember where exactly I read it a long time ago, but there's a saying about being on the edge of chaos is the best place for creativity. And that's a kind of theme that I feel with all this stuff around certainly the longevity and the sirtuins, but this whole energy thing. It's like we want to keep our system right at the edge it's at peak, so it's ready to perform when we need it. And actually things like hormesis, where you're stressing your system a little bit, but in a considered way, in a personal way, but with things like polyphenols, for example, those mild toxins, you're priming it, you're keeping it nimble, you're keeping it ready for action. So I think that's a really, really big theme there. I also think, this looking at one gene at a time has limits and limitations as an approach, and it's important to see the pathway, and that's how we will be presenting this information in our newest test, because then you can look at a certain kind of collection of genes and say, for this person, that really is a weaker point, and is there or are there certain nutrients or certain lifestyle activities that can hit several of those places, or are there specific things that work particularly specifically on one or two? So it's understanding the specific combination of variants for any individual that I think is really, really useful. I think one of the things that I found quite challenging looking at this from a perspective of performance and physical activity is the kind of longevity talk about caloric restriction. Kind of how do you manage caloric restriction when you want to make sure that you've got enough energy? And I think that's something that I always used to worry about as a runner, especially when I was training for long events. It'd be kind of like, I want to do a long run. How do you train for a long run? How do you fuel for a long run? What's the right way to do it? I mean, it's actually coming up to, it's about 8 years since I did a marathon. And I probably know a lot more now than I knew then. But I remember almost feeling kind of panicky about, I must have enough fuel. I think my approach now is much more that actually, if you train consistently, you can adapt a lot towards burning of fats for fuel. You need perhaps a little top up of glucose to get you through the wall parts of it, and to keep going on an actual event. But for me, I've always hated sugar. I mean, some people would say that's a bit of a blessing, but I always really, really disliked, especially kind of 20 years ago, the options you had with respect to things like performance gels and energy drinks and things like that. I just found it absolutely, that it just really, really turns me off, and I really, really struggles with it. But then again, what I think this brings and has brought me as well is this insight into natural ways of supporting yourself. I think I've only mentioned supplements once. I do believe that there is a time and a place for supplements, but I very firmly believe that there are lots and lots and lots of things that you can do with foods, and you see all the foods and the food components that I'm talking about here. So, for example, I'll just mention PQQ because I didn't talk about it in detail, but PQQ stands for pyrroloquinoline quinone, but it's very involved in PGC1A and also the mitochondria part. And look at the foods, kiwi, cocoa, things like that can just be really helpful. And another thing that the literature on longevity actually emphasizes with both polyphenols and antioxidants is variety. And I think that for me also applies to approaches to training. You can adapt to something in a good way, but you can also adapt in a way that it's not actually giving you the same stress benefits if you just do the same thing over and over and over again. It's like you've approached that pathway, you're in the groove, the body can do that when it's kind of pushed in that way. But actually having this broad variety of different polyphenols, different antioxidant foods, the same way that you'd think about variety and different types of training. So you're an endurance athlete, but you're still going to do some strength training. So the same principle, I think, applies throughout all of this. It's very, very consistent. So yeah, and this is just the table that I'm not going to go through. It's just there for your reference about, for this gene, these are the considerations, and these are the diet and lifestyle recommendations that might be supportive in the context of variation on those particular genes. Okay, so my little summary here. Exercise influences not just mitochondria, but that whole AMPK, PGC1A, a whole beneficial set of pathways and biochemistry and physiology, and not just physiology for movement, but also mental health as well. And in turn, so the exercise influences the mitochondria health and the mitochondria biogenesis, and increased capacity influences the exercise. So we have this interconnected virtuous cycles, or that's what we want to have, to allow ourselves to perform well as endurance athletes, and also to perform well for longer. And there is quite a lot of research, actually. Just Google endurance and lifespan or longevity, and loads of things will come up. Some of it fairly light, but actually some very, very convincing research about the benefit of endurance exercise and endurance sport, and also elite athletes in particular, because those are the ones that have been monitored, living substantially longer and living healthily for longer. I think that's the main thing. So my little sum up point is keep on running, but with a little help from nutrigenomics, because it is that consistency. Your mitochondria renew pretty rapidly, actually. So if you don't do any exercise for, if you take 2 months off and you do nothing, those poor old mitochondria are going to kind of start to go, oh, no one needs us anymore. We're just not as necessary. So, I'll go and put all my efforts into storing some fat instead, perhaps. So consistency is key in keeping that routine, but also varying it in terms of the types and the diet to support it. Okay. This is drawing out again, just our new test is going to include all these elements. What I've talked about today is just a little around nutrient sensing and a little bit about mitochondria. But there are these other elements. So obviously we didn't go deeply into fatty acid oxidation, ketogenesis, any of that. We didn't go deep into Krebs cycle or any of that. Similarly with glucose and blood sugar and all of that type of things, or proteins. Incidentally, I was speaking to a practitioner today who is an athlete and who works with athletes, and she was saying that she's noticing that a lot of middle-aged athletes have got terrible blood glucose kind of management. It's absolutely awful all over the place. And just, it's anecdotal, but I've noticed that just in talking to friends and colleagues my age, that, you know, and I think we could consider reasons for that. Certainly blood glucose regulation is subject to all kinds of stressors as we get older. But, you know, I'm not going to go into that here, but that's another dimension of this report. And the other dimension is energy intake and appetite and decisions that we make about what foods to eat. You know, like I said, I really genuinely do not like sugar, and I never have liked sugar, but I love cheese, for example. That's all to do with dopamine in a different way, and that's a story for another time. But your energy intake, appetite preferences are going to have an impact on everything downstream of that, and it's all connected, so it works both ways. So I think I always like to finish with a little bit of what inspired me. I'm a big reader and increasingly podcast listener, and these are some of the materials that have inspired the work that we've been doing in this space. I think my favourite is the Lifespan book. I've read it about 20 times and it's looking a bit dog-eared at the moment, but absolutely recommend that book if you want to know about Sirtuins and NAD+ and things like that. It's absolutely fab. I bought this book, Play On, about physical longevity. I found it a little bit light. It's got some nice anecdotes and it's got some nice stories about certain athletes who managed to keep performing and winning as they got older. But it doesn't really explain an awful lot to me, but it was quite a nice read. But yeah, there you go. Read to your heart's content if that's your thing, or look at the podcast for David A. Sinclair, who's the quite famous now, I think, longevity geneticist guy. That's just a bit about us. We are having a masterclass on bioenergetics in October, which will be all about that report. I'm not going to spend ages going into this, but the slides will be sent out by Ian and Simone afterwards. And I think that might be the end. I keep going, this is it, this is the end, and it's not quite finished. It's like getting towards the end of a race. But that is the end, I think. So yeah. Has anyone got any questions?
Thank you, Emma. I mentioned a couple of things I'll share with you, which I'll leave someone to mention to you tomorrow. It's just about the September webinar and the new course that we're going to run. So I'll let someone tell you about that tomorrow. We've got a couple of questions that came in. The first was recommendations for testing. So I presume, Emma, they just need to come onto your website and have a look at the one that you've got in the works here.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you just, I mean, this is just a little screenshot of our website. If you're a practitioner, you can just pop to the website and click on the practitioner link and sign up to our newsletter if you want. And that's the best way for us to keep you posted on our masterclass work. So that's what I would recommend. We don't spam you. We only send out a newsletter once a month. So, or any of these resources have lots and lots of little webinars about lots and lots of topics. But if you want to know about this masterclass, then the best way is to just sign up to our newsletter or register as a practitioner. We'll let you know.
Okay, and then Jenny was asking, well, saying she loves the idea of hormesis and being on the edge of chaos, as you mentioned, or edge of chaos is the best place for creativity. So keeping our body primed and ready for optimal response by exposing it to some stress, adaptive use stress rather than distress. You can apply this to sport and physical training, but I also wonder how far this physical priming transfers to peak performance and resilience in other areas of life, like business and general success. Okay, very interesting when considering our athlete clients too, in terms of their genetics and how this impacts and how we can support them. So kind of, she was sharing what she learned from this webinar. I'm going to ask for a sort of response there, and I'm also going to throw in a question from me as well. So I mentioned this, I'll throw it at you earlier. You mentioned endurance athletes could potentially live for 15 years longer, but in my clinic in Johannesburg, which is a big stress city, it definitely wasn't the picture I was seeing. I was seeing people in their 40s and 50s succumb to autoimmunity and chronic fatigue and really, really struggling, a lot of immune dysregulation and blood sugar dysregulation, because they've got a big focus on volume, and they've also got pride that they need to push hard in their business life. So can you maybe sort of give your perspective of the word balance in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I think it links actually quite nicely to that being on the right side of the cliff, doesn't it? It's like the load, the total load on the system. So there's good stress and there's bad stress, and there's also a limit. So everyone has a limit. A lot of our practitioners work with people who are really successful in their careers, and they just drive and drive and drive and drive themselves more, and until they don't, because they've gone over that edge, and the accumulation of all those different stressors and the chemicals that are generated as a result. So we create our own stress chemicals when we make adrenaline. That adrenaline, for example, has to be broken down, and it's part of detoxification. It's part of the load on our system and the pressure on our livers to neutralize these compounds, these chemicals. And so it's about the total amount. And if you're pushing yourself physically, then that's still got to be seen in the context of those other stresses and those other pressures on you. I think, yeah, it's about looking at the context again and looking at that whole person and what's going on. And I think that's the thing with like the approach to training that is about volume as well. That's kind of perhaps not quite so in vogue as it was. I don't know if it was in the Play On book actually, or another one, but there's a story in there about a football manager. It might have been Arsene Wenger actually, but it was that he always put enormous pressure on the team. And it was just train, more. But that team were always being injured, always off sick, always getting, infections or viruses or whatever it happens to be. And just the moral of that story, or the way it was told, was that that's kind of old school. It's about being able to understand the person and what is their stress tolerance and what are all the factors that are playing into that. And also, I guess in a city, it's the same in London to some extent. You've got pollution. I often used to think about people who cycled to work, and I used to run to work at one point along a main road, and I was really, really conscious of I'm actually doing myself more harm than good. Breathing in all this stuff. I'm kind of physically active, but I'm also creating a massive load of toxic input. And actually now in London, I do water. I run along canals, I run along rivers, I go to the Olympic Park. I'll do anything to avoid a busy road. It's still a city, but I think that's still a consideration. It's part of that. So
yeah, considering everything, and I think it was very clear from your genetics presentation, there are so many different variants that each person can have. And some people, I describe them as diesel engines, seem to just be able to chug along and push through everything. Whereas others, you know, they're doing only part of the training of these guys, and their boss isn't quite as demanding, but their immune system's up and down and constantly injured. So yeah, we need to bring it into the individual context and really work on the N=1. That is our client.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's things like, you know, when people are younger, they think they can get away with things, and some of them can more than others, because it comes back to that N=1. But actually, you know, the guy who's training hard all week, if he then goes out and has 8 pints on a Saturday night and a pizza and stuff, it's almost like he's just taking it all away again, isn't it? All the inflammation and the depletion of the nutrients. So we're kind of talking about, oh, have you got enough NAD plus and but actually, if you're detoxifying 8 pints of beer, then you're just absolutely going to deplete all those vitamins. It's kind of taken away with one hand and putting in with the other.
Yeah. So we had one last question, but I think it's the topic for another very large presentation. And that was any noted effects of genes being activated post-COVID and vaccines. So that would be fascinating, but I think we can leave that to another time.
We've actually got, we do have a snapshot about that, actually, if you want to look. So we did some research with a functional medicine doctor around patients with long COVID, and we saw some patterns of certain genotypes. Again, not one gene, like, let's face it, if there was one SNP that meant you got long COVID, everybody would know about it by now. But it's looking at these things in the context of other genes, and like, what's the stress load on that person to start with, for example? You know, were they close to that edge anyway? Were they metabolically kind of functional anyway? So yeah, it is big. Not easy to answer.
Yeah, massive discussion.
Yeah.
So thank you, Emma. That was a real pleasure. So yeah, I learned a lot, and I think you gave us a really good demonstration of integrative thinking. So one of the good biochemistry thinkers that can pull it together. So thank you for that.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody. Yeah, see you soon. Good evening.
So good night, everyone, and we'll see you next month, hopefully.